I'm a 26-year-old guy, and this is the story of how I realized the dream of owning my first home while navigating a mess of parental control and manipulation that I never saw coming. It's been a wild ride, but here's how it all began. Growing up, my parents always had a tight grip on everything. They weren't the type to encourage freedom or independence. In our house, their word was law, and there was no room for debate. If you even dared to push back, the answer was simple: our way or the highway. That was the world I grew up in. Despite all that, I always knew I wanted more for myself. I worked hard in high school and juggled multiple part-time jobs to save for college. When I finally got there, I didn't have the luxury of coasting through. While my friends were spending their weekends partying, I was pulling shifts at the campus dining hall or delivering food late into the night. My parents weren't going to pay for school, so I knew I had to make it happen on my own. After graduation, I kept the hustle going. I took on freelance gigs, picked up overtime whenever I could, and pinched every penny. My goal was clear: I wanted to own a home before I hit 30. By some miracle, or sheer willpower, I managed to do it by 26. It wasn't a mansion or anything fancy. It was a small fixer-upper on the edge of town, but it was mine. No co-signers, no loans from family, just me and the savings I'd spent years building. Closing on the house was one of the best days of my life. The sense of accomplishment was unreal, but of course the joy didn't last long. My parents, who I hadn't even told about the purchase until after it was a done deal, didn't take the news well. To say they were upset is putting it mildly. They couldn't believe I'd made such a major life decision without involving them. My mom kept repeating that I was too young to take on the responsibility of a house, while my dad muttered about how I was going to ruin myself financially. At first, I thought they were just venting and would eventually come around. But then the comments started getting weirder. About a week after I moved in, my mom referred to the house as a phase and casually mentioned how I could always come back home if things didn't work out. It felt like a slap in the face, but I brushed it off. I told myself they just needed time to adjust. It wasn't long before they started showing up unannounced. At first, it was under the guise of helping me settle in. My dad criticized the paint color in the living room, calling it immature, while my mom fussed over the kitchen cabinets, insisting they needed to be replaced immediately. They weren't offering to pay for any of this, of course. It was just their way of making me feel like I wasn't capable of managing my own home. Then came the first major red flag. One evening, I came home to find that my water had been shut off. After a long call with the utility company, I learned that someone had called to cancel service, claiming to be me. I couldn't prove who it was, but I had a sinking feeling my parents were behind it. When I casually mentioned it to them later, they played dumb, but the looks on their faces told me everything I needed to know. Still, I tried to keep the peace. I didn't want to believe they'd actually sabotage me, but things only escalated from there. A few weeks later, I found out they were still tracking my location through an old family phone plan. I hadn't realized I was still on it, and when I confronted them about it, they acted offended, saying it was just in case of emergencies. That was the last straw. I disabled location sharing and started taking steps to untangle myself from any shared accounts or lingering ties. That's when things got really messy. My parents acted like I'd betrayed them. They accused me of being ungrateful and abandoning family. They'd always had a way of making me feel guilty for asserting my independence, and this was no different. Not long after, I got a notification about my mortgage payment. It said the payment was in dispute, which didn't make any sense since I hadn't made any changes to my account. When I called the bank, they told me someone had attempted to access my account and dispute the payment on my behalf. The only emergency contact listed on the account was my parents. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just meddling, they were actively trying to sabotage me. I felt like the rug had been pulled out from under me. Everything I'd worked so hard for was suddenly at risk, all because my parents couldn't let go of their control. Looking back, the signs were there all along, but I'd convinced myself that their behavior was just overprotectiveness. Now, I was starting to see the full picture, and it wasn't pretty. Update 1. The day after the strange notification about my mortgage dispute, I decided to dig deeper into my finances. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I started with a credit report check, which I hadn't done in a while. What I found sent me spiraling into a rabbit hole I wasn't prepared for. There was a recent inquiry tied to my mortgage account, something I hadn't authorized. I immediately called my mortgage provider. After navigating through the usual customer service maze, I finally got through to a representative. They confirmed there had been an attempt to access my account a few days prior. According to their records, someone emailed them asking to change some account details and dispute the last payment. The request didn't come from my email address, and the representative flagged it because the proof of identity provided didn't match my file. That's when the sinking realization hit: it had to be my parents. I knew my parents had access to some of my old financial information. Back when I was younger and needed their help co-signing for things like my first credit card, they kept copies of everything. I had assumed it was harmless, just part of their overly involved nature. But now, I wasn't so sure. I decided to check for myself. That evening, I stopped by their house under the pretense of visiting. While they were distracted in the kitchen, I searched through the old filing cabinet where they'd always kept important documents. Sure enough, some of my paperwork was still there: tax returns from when I was in college, student loan statements, and even some outdated account numbers. But a few key things were missing. I couldn't find the most recent copies of my mortgage paperwork or any of the closing documents for my house. My gut told me they'd taken them. I confronted them right then and there. Their reaction was exactly what I should have expected. They didn't deny it outright. Instead, they danced around the issue, claiming they were just trying to help. My mom doubled down, saying the house was a mistake and that she'd stepped in to save me from financial disaster. When I pushed for an explanation about the forged email, they changed the subject entirely and accused me of being ungrateful. Then, in a twist I didn't see coming, they suggested I sell the house and start fresh, promising they'd help me manage things better next time. I walked out before the conversation could escalate further. By then, I was shaking with frustration. I called my younger sibling to vent. They weren't surprised. Apparently, our parents had pulled similar stunts with them in the past, though not on this scale. Hearing this only fueled my determination to set boundaries. The next day at work, I told a coworker the whole story. They were horrified and immediately suggested I consult a lawyer. They also gave me some practical advice: audit all my accounts, update every password, and make sure I wasn't leaving any doors open for my parents to meddle further. The advice turned out to be a lifesaver. When I checked my accounts, I found traces of their meddling in places I hadn't even thought about. My old childhood savings account, which was still under their names, had suddenly been drained. The amount wasn't huge since I hadn't used it in years, but the principle of it stung. They'd also been keeping tabs on my activity through the family phone plan, even after I thought I'd shut off their access. That night, I changed every password, set up two-factor authentication, and updated all my contact information with the bank and utility companies. I even installed a home security system and changed the locks. If my parents were willing to go this far, I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. Their response to my actions was as predictable as it was infuriating. Within days, they called to berate me for overreacting. When I didn't respond, they left passive-aggressive voicemails, accusing me of abandoning the family and being manipulated by outside influences. When that didn't work, they escalated, threatening to cut me off completely unless I came to my senses. I didn't cave. Instead, I decided to take control of the narrative and posted my story on Reddit. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I needed advice from people who'd been through similar situations, or at least an outlet to document everything that was happening. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, I had hundreds of comments offering support, advice, and even legal resources. People encouraged me to stand my ground and reminded me that protecting my independence wasn't selfish, it was necessary. As I read through the comments, I felt more resolved than ever to keep pushing forward. My parents might have spent years trying to control my life, but this was where I drew the line. I wasn't just fighting for my house, I was fighting for my freedom. Update 2. After my first Reddit post gained traction, I realized I wasn't alone. Hundreds of people shared their stories about controlling parents and gave me advice that I never would have thought of on my own. The top suggestion: speak to a lawyer. That's exactly what I did. The following Monday, I took the morning off work and met with an attorney specializing in identity theft and financial security. I laid everything out: the attempted access to my mortgage account, the forged email, the missing documents, and even the fact that my childhood savings had mysteriously disappeared. The lawyer didn't seem shocked, which was both reassuring and disheartening. They explained that cases like mine were more common than I realized, especially when controlling parents refused to let go of their adult children. The first step was securing my mortgage account. The lawyer helped me file a formal report with my bank to block any unauthorized access and ensure no one but me could make changes. They also recommended I request an audit of all account activity over the last few months, just to see if there were any other attempts I'd missed. With those safeguards in place, we moved on to the next issue: my parents' escalating behavior. Blocking their access to my accounts only seemed to embolden them. When my parents found out I'd hired a lawyer, they were livid. I found out because they showed up at my house, again, banging on the door and shouting about how I was dragging family through the mud. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat in my living room with the blinds drawn, silently watching them through the security camera feed on my phone. Eventually, they left, but not before shoving a handwritten note under my door. The note was just as passive-aggressive as I expected, filled with accusations about me destroying the family and insisting I get help before it's too late. That night, I decided enough was enough. I blocked their numbers and all their social media accounts. It wasn't easy, but I needed to create some space. Of course, blocking them didn't stop their antics. A few days later, I found another note in my mailbox. Then another. One was taped to my front door. I started keeping a folder of these notes, knowing I'd need documentation if things got worse. Thankfully, my sibling had my back. They helped me install additional cameras around the house, covering every possible angle. They also helped me set up motion-activated lights in the front yard, which seemed to deter my parents from lingering too long. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over the situation. Then came the social media drama. A family friend who clearly had no idea what was really going on started posting vague status updates about disrespectful children and ungrateful attitudes. The timing and phrasing made it obvious they were referring to me. Mutual friends began reaching out, asking if everything was okay. I kept my responses vague, not wanting to add fuel to the fire, but it was exhausting trying to control the narrative while my parents spread their version of events. Around this time, I started seeing a therapist. The lawyer had suggested it, and honestly, it was one of the best decisions I made. The therapist helped me unpack years of manipulation and control that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. More importantly, they gave me strategies to handle the guilt my parents were so good at weaponizing. At my next meeting with the lawyer, we tackled the issue of my childhood savings account. I had assumed that account was long gone, but the lawyer explained that if my parents had taken money that legally belonged to me, I might have a case. However, when I confronted my parents about it, through a carefully worded email, they flat out refused to hand over the account, claiming it wasn't really mine. That was their justification. Since they'd opened it for me as a child, they had the right to do whatever they wanted with it. The lawyer assured me we could challenge this, but it would take time. In the meantime, my parents didn't let up. They continued showing up unannounced, leaving notes, and trying to force their way back into my life. I finally filed a police report for harassment, detailing every uninvited visit and every note they'd left. The officer I spoke with took it seriously, which was a relief. They promised to follow up if my parents crossed any legal boundaries. Of course, when my parents found out about the police report, they doubled down. Their justification: they were just protecting their son and doing what any good parents would do. It didn't matter that I was nearly 30, living on my own, and capable of making my own decisions. To them, I was still the kid they could control. Reddit was my lifeline during all of this. People encouraged me to keep documenting everything and even offered advice on how to handle the legal process. One user suggested sending a cease and desist letter to my parents, which my lawyer agreed was the next logical step. We drafted a formal letter warning them to stop all contact with me, unless they wanted to face legal consequences. It was mailed the next day. After sending the letter, I knew the situation would either escalate or start to die down. Either way, I was prepared. My parents might have spent years controlling every aspect of my life, but this time, I wasn't backing down. To keep everyone in the loop, I posted an update on Reddit detailing everything that had happened since my initial post. The support was overwhelming, and it gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. This wasn't just about standing up to my parents anymore, it was about reclaiming my independence once and for all. Update 3. The cease and desist letter was supposed to be a turning point. My lawyer had assured me it was a strong warning, one that legally required my parents to stop their harassment or face potential consequences. It was the right move, but instead of backing down, my parents saw it as a challenge. Within a week of receiving the letter, they ramped up their manipulation tactics. First, it started with emails and voicemails from extended family members. Aunts, uncles, and cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly reached out, pleading with me to forgive my parents and be the bigger person. The messages ranged from guilt trips about family unity to outright accusations that I was overreacting. It didn't take long to figure out my parents had been calling everyone they could think of, spinning their own version of the story. I ignored the messages at first, but when they kept coming, I blocked the most persistent ones. This only led to more drama. A few family members posted vague status updates on social media about ungrateful kids these days and how family should come first. It was exhausting, but I refused to let them pull me into their narrative. During all of this, my sibling dropped a bombshell. We were catching up over coffee when they revealed something I hadn't known before. Years ago, our parents had tried a similar stunt with them. Back then, our sibling had been applying for a business loan and discovered our parents had accessed their financial records to help by offering unsolicited advice to the bank. Thankfully, they hadn't succeeded, but it explained why my sibling had distanced themselves from our parents long before I had. As if dealing with my extended family wasn't enough, I started receiving anonymous threatening texts. The messages weren't explicit, but they were unsettling. Comments about how I was making a mistake, that I'd regret this, and cryptic remarks about what goes around comes around. I suspected my parents were behind them, but there was no way to prove it. I reported the messages to the police, adding them to my growing case file. After that, I blocked every extended family member who tried to pressure me into reconciling. I had no interest in explaining myself to people who didn't understand the full story. Meanwhile, my neighbors were starting to notice my parents' behavior. They'd seen my parents sitting in their car outside my house on multiple occasions and even witnessed them leaving notes on my door. One neighbor was kind enough to give me video footage from their doorbell camera, which showed my parents lingering on the sidewalk after I refused to let them in. The final straw came when I got a notification about a credit card application I hadn't made. When I called the bank, they told me someone had attempted to open a joint credit card in my name, listing my mother as the co-applicant. I was furious but not surprised. I immediately updated my police report to include this attempted fraud. The officer handling my case assured me they were taking it seriously and would follow up if my parents crossed any more lines. Then came the Facebook post. My parents wrote a scathing public rant about how I had turned my back on family and how they were devastated by my actions. They painted themselves as the victims, claiming they were only trying to help and that I had cut them out of my life for no reason. Friends and relatives who didn't know the full story started chiming in, some expressing sympathy for them and others questioning what had really happened. I didn't engage. Instead, I took screenshots of everything and sent them to my lawyer. My therapist also encouraged me to stay firm and not get dragged into the drama. They reminded me that my parents were trying to provoke a reaction and that the best response was no response at all. A few days later, my parents left a dramatic letter on my doorstep. In it, they blamed me for breaking the family apart and accused me of being ungrateful for everything they'd done for me. It was over 3 pages long, filled with emotional manipulation and backhanded comments. I didn't even finish reading it. I handed it over to my lawyer, who added it to the growing pile of evidence. My coworkers, who'd been following the saga, were incredibly supportive. They encouraged me to keep standing up for myself and reminded me that I wasn't alone. One even offered to help me draft a letter to HR in case my parents tried to show up at my workplace. Their support made a huge difference, especially on days when the stress felt overwhelming. To keep myself grounded, I returned to Reddit and shared another update. The response was overwhelming. Again, hundreds of people chimed in with advice, validation, and stories of their own experiences with controlling parents. Knowing I wasn't alone helped me push through the emotional toll this was taking. By this point, it was clear my parents weren't going to stop unless legal action forced them to. The situation was far from over, but with every step I took to protect myself, I felt like I was regaining a little more control over my life. Update 4. After the letter incident, I knew it was time to finalize my independence. It wasn't just about cutting ties emotionally. I needed to sever every lingering connection my parents could exploit. The first step was closing every shared account. My childhood savings were tied up with them, and although my lawyer said it might take a while to resolve, I opened a new bank account and moved every cent I could access into it. I also updated all my legal documents, emergency contacts, beneficiary details, and anything else they could use to insert themselves into my life. For my home, I upgraded security again. I installed motion detectors around the property, set to trigger both lights and alerts on my phone. I added a second layer of locks to the doors and reinforced the windows. My sibling helped me test everything, and we joked about how my house was turning into a fortress. But after everything my parents had pulled, I wasn't taking chances. Just as I was starting to feel more secure, they tried a new tactic. A family friend showed up at my door uninvited, claiming they were there to mediate. They'd clearly been sent by my parents and tried to convince me to sit down and talk things out. I politely declined, but when they pressed, I shut the door and called my lawyer. The lawyer advised me to keep documenting everything, and I added the incident to my growing folder. The fallout from my parents' actions began rippling through the extended family. Some relatives reached out to say they understood my side, while others doubled down on guilt tripping. One aunt posted a long, emotional rant online about how family should always come first and people need to learn forgiveness. It was vague but unmistakably directed at me. This kicked off a mini war in the comments, with family members taking sides. Watching it play out was surreal, but I stayed out of it. Meanwhile, my sibling made a big decision of their own. After hearing about the fake credit card attempt and the escalating harassment, they went no contact with our parents too. They'd already been distant for years, but this was the final straw. Knowing they were fully in my corner made a huge difference. We started talking more regularly, and they helped me navigate the mess our parents had created. Things took another bizarre turn when my parents created fake accounts to comment on my Reddit post. At first, I didn't realize it was them. The accounts left inflammatory comments, accusing me of lying, being ungrateful, and exaggerating the situation. But their tone and phrasing gave them away. These were things only my parents would say. Redditors were quick to call them out, and several users helped me identify and report the accounts. The moderators banned them within hours. That small victory felt like a turning point. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand. My parents could try all the manipulation tactics they wanted, but they weren't going to win. I wasn't the scared, unsure person they used to control. With every step I took to protect myself, their power over me diminished. As things started to settle down, I reflected on how far I'd come. Setting boundaries had been the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the most necessary. Growing up, I'd been taught that family was everything and that standing up for myself meant disrespecting them. Now I saw things differently. Respect is a two-way street, and my parents had spent years bulldozing over mine. Just when I thought they'd finally back off, they pulled one last dramatic stunt. They showed up at my workplace. I don't know how they found out where I worked, but they came in during my lunch break, demanding to see me. Thankfully, my coworkers knew about the situation and immediately alerted HR. By the time I came back, HR had already intervened and escorted my parents out of the building. They warned them to stay away or risk legal action for trespassing. That was the final straw. I filed for a restraining order the very next day. My lawyer was confident we had enough evidence to secure one. Between the notes, the uninvited visits, the fake credit card attempt, and the workplace incident, it was clear they weren't going to stop on their own. The process took a few weeks, but the restraining order was granted. My parents were legally required to stay away from me and my property. The support I received during this time was overwhelming. My coworkers, sibling, and even complete strangers on Reddit rallied around me, reminding me that I wasn't alone. Every comment, message, and kind word helped me push through the emotional toll of cutting ties with my parents. With the restraining order in place, I started to focus on rebuilding my life. I returned to therapy, where I began unpacking the years of manipulation and control. I threw myself into home improvement projects, finally turning my house into a space that felt like mine. Each small change, painting a wall, fixing a broken cabinet, planting flowers in the yard, was a reminder that I was free. I shared one last update on Reddit to thank everyone for their support. The response was incredible, with thousands of people cheering me on and sharing their own stories. Knowing that my experience had resonated with so many others made the entire ordeal feel worthwhile. For the first time in my life, I felt truly independent. There was still work to do. Healing isn't an overnight process, but I was finally on the right path. Update 5. After months of turmoil, the restraining order was granted. My parents were legally required to stay away from me, my property, and my workplace. I walked out of that courtroom with a sense of relief I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the restraining order itself, it was the final boundary they couldn't cross without facing serious consequences. With that weight lifted, I was able to focus on the lingering legal issues. My lawyer and I had been working on regaining control of my childhood savings account, which my parents had claimed wasn't really mine. After reviewing the account's history and providing evidence of their mishandling, the bank ruled in my favor. The money wasn't much, but it was symbolic. It was one less thread tying me to their control. Meanwhile, things at work were looking up. I'd thrown myself into my projects during this time, partly to distract myself from everything happening outside the office. My efforts paid off when I received a promotion that not only boosted my salary but also solidified my financial independence. Knowing I could rely solely on myself felt like a victory in more ways than one. My sibling, who had been my rock through all of this, made their own big move, literally. They accepted a job in another state, putting even more distance between themselves and our parents. We promised to stay in touch regularly, and though I'd miss having them nearby, I was proud of them for taking this step for their own peace of mind. As for my parents, they went quiet after the restraining order. There were no more unannounced visits, no cryptic messages, no sudden outbursts on social media. For the first time in months, I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder. My lawyer warned me to stay vigilant, but I allowed myself to hope that they'd finally gotten the message. Of course, that hope didn't last long. About 6 weeks after the restraining order was granted, I received a letter in the mail. It was from my parents. I didn't open it. Instead, I handed it over to my lawyer. Whatever it said wasn't going to change my decision. I had no interest in rekindling any kind of relationship with them. With the drama winding down, I began focusing on myself for the first time in years. Therapy became a regular part of my routine, and my sessions shifted from crisis management to deeper healing. I started to understand just how much their manipulation had shaped my life and how long it would take to fully undo those patterns. It was hard work, but it was worth it. I also turned my attention to my house, which had been a point of contention from the very beginning. Slowly but surely, I began making it feel like home. I repainted the walls, fixed up the backyard, and even tackled some DIY projects I'd been putting off. Every improvement, no matter how small, felt like a step forward, a way of reclaiming my space and my independence. The support I received from Reddit during all of this was nothing short of incredible. My posts had gained a lot of traction, and the final update garnered over 20,000 upvotes. Reading the comments was overwhelming in the best way. People praised my resilience, shared their own stories of breaking free from toxic relationships, and reminded me that I wasn't alone. Knowing my journey had resonated with so many strangers was a strange but comforting feeling. Extended family members still tried to guilt-trip me from time to time, but I stayed firm in my decision to go no contact. Their opinions didn't matter to me anymore. I wasn't going to sacrifice my peace of mind to keep up appearances for people who had no idea what I'd been through. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel more like myself again. I began reconnecting with old friends, strengthening my support network, and making plans for the future. I even started thinking about new goals, traveling, taking up a new hobby, maybe even starting my own business someday. For the first time in a long time, the possibilities felt endless. In my final Reddit post, I thanked the community for their unwavering support. Without their advice and encouragement, I don't know if I would have had the strength to stand up to my parents. The comments reminded me of how far I'd come and how much I'd gained by finally putting myself first. Looking ahead, I feel optimistic. My life isn't perfect, and there are still days when the past feels closer than it should. But I'm no longer defined by the control and manipulation I grew up with. I've built a life that's truly mine, and I'm excited to see where it takes me. To anyone reading this who's in a similar situation, I hope my story shows that it's possible to break free and thrive. It's not easy, and it's not quick, but it's worth it. Thank you for being part of my journey. I'm a 28-year-old guy living in a mid-sized city, working a steady job in the corporate world. My apartment is nothing fancy, just a modest one-bedroom I rent in a decent neighborhood. It's the kind of place where the walls are a bit too thin and the rent goes up every year, but it's mine, and I make it work. My life is pretty stable. I've got my budget locked down to the penny, balancing rent, utilities, groceries, and my student loan payments. It's not glamorous, but I've worked hard to build this little corner of stability for myself. Now, let me introduce my younger brother, who's 24. He graduated from college about a year ago with a degree that seemed promising at first. But since then, he's been bouncing between part-time gigs and temporary jobs, none of which have come close to covering his bills. His financial situation has been a mess for as long as I can remember. He's constantly behind on rent, scrambling to pay for his car, and always living one unexpected expense away from disaster. Over the past year, I've loaned him money twice. The first time, it was for his rent. He was about to get evicted, and my mom called me, practically begging me to step in. I figured it was a one-time thing, so I transferred the money, hoping he'd figure things out. The second time, it was for his car repair. He called me in a panic, saying he couldn't get to work without it, so I covered the repair bill. Each time, he promised he'd pay me back. But here's the thing, he never did. Not a single cent. Our family has always been close, at least on the surface. My mom is in her 50s, and she's the glue that holds us together, or maybe the duct tape, considering how things are now. She's protective of my brother to a fault. In her eyes, he's just going through a tough time, and it's our job as a family to help him out. It doesn't matter how many times he makes the same mistakes or how little effort he puts into fixing them. According to her, family always comes first, no questions asked. I've always had mixed feelings about this dynamic. On one hand, I care about my brother. I don't want to see him struggle or fail. But on the other hand, it's exhausting to keep stepping in when he's not taking responsibility for his own life. My mom's constant guilt tripping doesn't help. Every time I hesitate to help, she reminds me of all the time she's sacrificed for us when we were kids. She's good at making me feel like the bad guy if I even think about saying no. The thing is, my brother has grown way too comfortable with this setup. He doesn't even try to hide it anymore. He knows that if he messes up, someone, usually me or my mom, will swoop in and fix it. He talks a big game about job applications and interviews, but it's all just talk. Meanwhile, he's still spending money on takeout and streaming subscriptions while his bills pile up. It's like he's not even trying. This brings me to the latest situation. A few days ago, my mom called me out of the blue. I could tell from the tone of her voice that she was about to ask for something. She started with small talk, asking how work was going, and if I'd seen the latest family group chat update. Then she got to the point, my brother was behind on rent again, and his landlord was threatening to kick him out. She wanted me to help. Again. I told her I couldn't do it this time. My own budget is stretched thin, and I can't keep bailing him out. I thought she'd understand, but she didn't. Instead, she launched into the usual lecture about how family sticks together and how I'm in a better position to help than anyone else. She even brought up how much my brother looks up to me, as if that somehow justified the constant handouts. When I stood firm, things escalated quickly. My brother got wind of the situation and called me, furious. He accused me of abandoning him, of being selfish and uncaring. He said I had no idea what it was like to struggle like he does. The irony wasn't lost on me. I've been struggling for years, just in a different way. The difference is I've learned how to handle it without relying on anyone else. The tension didn't stop there. My mom called me back later that night, more upset than before. She said I was being unfair and that I didn't appreciate what it meant to be part of a family. She even implied that I'd forgotten where I came from, like I was some kind of stranger to them now. That conversation left me drained, but also determined. I realized I couldn't keep doing this. Every time I help, it just enables my brother to keep avoiding responsibility. And every time I refuse, I get painted as the villain. It's a no-win situation, but something has to change. I just don't know how to make them see it. Update 1. Over the past year, I've loaned my brother money twice. The first time, it was for his rent. He was about to get evicted, and I didn't want him to end up on the street. My mom had called, painting the situation like it was life or death, so I stepped in and covered what he owed. He promised he'd pay me back once he got his finances in order, but that never happened. The second time, it was for his car repair. He said he needed the car to get to work, so I transferred the money, thinking it was an investment in his ability to stay employed. Again, no repayment, not even an offer. This latest situation started like the others. My mom called me saying my brother was behind on rent again, and his landlord was threatening to kick him out. This would be the third time this year, and she wanted me to help cover it. She framed it like it wasn't just about him, it was about keeping the family together, about not abandoning each other during tough times. She said he was trying his best, but just couldn't catch a break. I told her I couldn't do it. My own finances were tight, and I'd already given more than I could afford. She didn't take that well. She started listing all the sacrifices she made for us when we were kids, reminding me of how she used to work 2 jobs to keep us afloat. She said I was in a better position than most people my age, and that I should be using my privilege to help my brother. When I didn't budge, she accused me of being ungrateful and forgetting what it meant to be part of a family. Meanwhile, my brother wasn't exactly doing his part. He was still working odd jobs here and there, never anything steady, and he hadn't even tried to get a roommate to split his rent. He spent money on things like takeout and new clothes while claiming he couldn't afford the basics. It wasn't like he didn't have options, he just wasn't taking any of them seriously. When my mom realized I wasn't going to cave, she told my brother. That's when the real drama started. He called me furious. He said I was selfish and had no idea what it was like to struggle. He told me I was abandoning him during one of the hardest times of his life. The conversation escalated quickly, with him throwing every guilt trip he could think of. I didn't engage. I just kept repeating that I couldn't help this time. That night, my mom called again. This time, she was even more upset. She said I was driving a wedge through the family and warned me that things would fall apart if I didn't pitch in. She accused me of being too independent, like that was a bad thing, and said I'd forgotten where I came from. She made it sound like I was the one causing all the problems, not my brother. The tension kept building. My brother still hadn't paid me back for either of the previous loans, and there was no sign he ever planned to. When I brought this up to my mom, she brushed it off, saying he'd repay me when he could. But he'd been saying that for months, and I was done waiting. My own budget was stretched thin. Between my rent, utilities, and student loans, I didn't have room to keep bailing him out. The arguments with my mom became more heated. She kept pushing, saying I was being cold and ungrateful. I pointed out that helping him hadn't actually helped at all. It just gave him an excuse to keep avoiding responsibility. She didn't want to hear it. To her, this wasn't about logic, it was about loyalty. After days of back and forth, I finally made my decision. I told my mom and brother that I wouldn't be giving him any more money. I said he needed to figure things out on his own, and I meant it. My mom was devastated. She said I was turning my back on the family and warned me that there would be consequences. My brother called me one last time, trying to convince me to change my mind, but it wasn't a real conversation, it was just more blame and guilt. I stuck to my decision, but the fallout has been brutal. My mom hasn't stopped texting me, alternating between guilt trips and outright anger. My brother is barely speaking to me, and when he does, it's only to tell me how selfish I am. The tension is unbearable, but I know this was the right call. Every time I've helped him in the past, it's only delayed the inevitable. He needs to take responsibility for his life, and I can't keep sacrificing my own stability to save him from his choices. For now, I've drawn the line. No more loans, no more handouts. If he wants to turn things around, he'll have to do it himself. I just hope the rest of the family can see that this isn't about abandoning him. It's about giving him the push he needs to finally grow up. But judging by their reactions so far, I'm not holding my breath. Update 2. The fallout started almost immediately. The day after I told my mom and brother I wouldn't be giving him any more money, my phone was blowing up with calls and texts. My mom wasn't holding back. She called me selfish, ungrateful, and even cold-hearted. She said I didn't understand what family was about and accused me of turning my back on my brother during a time when he needed me most. Every message was a mix of guilt trips and anger, making it clear she thought I was the problem, not my brother. My brother was no better. He sent me a long message saying I was abandoning him and proving that I never truly cared about him. He brought up how I was lucky to have a stable job and how it wasn't fair that I wouldn't share what I had to help him out. He threw in a line about how I'd regret this one day when I'd need help and no one would be there for me. It was classic manipulation, but it still stung to read. The tension spread quickly to the rest of the family. My mom made it her mission to call everyone and tell them her version of what happened. Suddenly, I was the villain of the family group chat. A couple of my cousins reached out to ask if everything was okay, clearly trying to stay neutral, but it was obvious they'd heard the story. My aunt, who's always been close to my mom, made a passive-aggressive post on Facebook about how some people forget their roots when they get a little success. I didn't respond, but I knew it was directed at me. My siblings were also dragged into the mess. I've got two younger sisters and they were caught in the middle. One of them sided with me, saying she understood why I had to draw a line. The other thought I was being too harsh, and that I should have at least covered this last rent payment to give him more time. Their disagreement only made things more complicated, and now family group calls are basically a battlefield. At this point, my mom and I weren't even speaking directly. She'd send me guilt-laden texts every day, accusing me of ruining the family and making things worse for everyone. She hinted that if I didn't help, she might step in herself, even though I know she doesn't have the money to do it. The silence between us during family gatherings was unbearable, and it felt like every interaction was filled with unspoken tension. Meanwhile, my brother was supposedly looking for a job, but it was the same half-hearted effort as always. He posted on social media about attending a couple of interviews, but nothing came of them. I overheard from my sister that he wasn't applying to anything outside of his dream job list, which was full of positions he wasn't even qualified for. It was clear he wasn't taking his situation seriously. He even made a post complaining about how hard it is for people like him to get ahead when the system is stacked against them. The comments were full of sympathy from his friends, but no one seemed to point out that he wasn't exactly helping himself. The guilt trips from my mom kept coming. She started sending me long messages about how hard she worked to raise us, and how I was supposed to support my brother because family always helps family. She even threw in that I was being heartless for not giving him a chance to get back on his feet. It was relentless. At one point, she told me I was forcing her into a corner, implying that I'd have to take responsibility for whatever happened to my brother if I didn't change my mind. There was a brief moment where my brother tried to apologize. He called me and said he was sorry for the way he'd reacted, but the apology felt hollow. He quickly shifted the conversation to how much pressure he was under and how hard it was to make ends meet. It didn't feel genuine. It felt like another attempt to manipulate me into changing my mind. I told him I couldn't keep helping unless he started making real changes, and he hung up on me. Looking back, this wasn't new. My brother has been relying on me, or someone else, to fix his problems for years. I've covered for him more times than I can count, and every time he promises it'll be the last. But it never is. This time, I decided I wasn't going to let the pattern continue. I needed to set boundaries, no matter how difficult it was, or how much backlash I got from the family. Eventually, my brother gave me an ultimatum. He told me that if I didn't help him, he'd consider our relationship over. He said he couldn't believe I was willing to let him fail, and that it proved I didn't care about him. It was a heavy statement, but I stood firm. I told him I wouldn't be giving him any more money unless he started showing genuine effort to get back on track. That didn't go over well. My mom was furious when she found out and told me I was breaking the family apart. My brother blocked me on social media and hasn't reached out since. The tension with my mom is still ongoing, but I haven't backed down. At this point, I'm done being the safety net. If my brother wants to fix his life, he'll have to do it himself. Update 3. A week after my brother gave me the ultimatum about helping him or losing our relationship, he followed through. I got a notification that he'd blocked me on all social media. He didn't send a text or make a call, just disappeared from my digital life. I wasn't surprised. He'd always been more about dramatic gestures than honest conversations. My mom, of course, was quick to pick up the torch. She called me late that night. The conversation wasn't anything new. She leaned hard into guilt, saying I was not a good sibling and had no heart. She told me I didn't understand how hard things were for my brother and how I was making it worse by refusing to help. I tried to keep my responses calm and measured, but it didn't seem to matter. Every answer I gave only fueled her frustration. She ended the call by saying she didn't know who I'd become, but that she was disappointed in me as a son. While all of this was happening, my friends became an unexpected lifeline. I don't usually bring personal family drama into my friend group, but I needed to vent. When I told them what was going on, they were shocked, not at my decision, but at how long I'd been putting up with this dynamic. They reminded me that I wasn't responsible for my brother's choices, especially when he wasn't doing anything to help himself. Hearing that from people outside the situation made a big difference. Then, out of nowhere, my sister called me to vent about something unrelated, and the topic of my brother came up. She told me he'd been posting vague, passive-aggressive updates on social media, things like, "It's hard when the people who are supposed to love you the most turn their backs on you, and some people care more about their wallets than their family." Apparently, some of his friends even started commenting things like, "You deserve better," and "Cut out the toxic people." It was obvious he was painting himself as the victim to anyone who would listen. What really pushed me over the edge, though, was when I heard about where his money had been going. My sister let it slip that he'd spent most of his paycheck on takeout, online subscriptions, and even some unnecessary gadgets over the past few months. He wasn't struggling because life had dealt him a bad hand. He was struggling because he refused to prioritize. I realized that every dollar I'd given him in the past had probably gone the same way, and it reinforced my decision to stop enabling him. My mom, meanwhile, wasn't backing down. She called again a few days later, this time with an ultimatum of her own. She said I was putting her in a position where she'd have to step in to help my brother, even though she couldn't afford it. She said if she ended up in financial trouble because of this, it would be on me. She brought up the idea that I was ruining the family, saying that my refusal to help was creating a divide that might never heal. I didn't engage with her arguments. At this point, it felt like we were running in circles. As my own financial pressures started mounting, thanks to rising rent and a surprise medical bill, I knew I had no room to bend. The constant demands for money were draining, and I couldn't keep sacrificing my own stability just to keep the peace. I decided to have a serious conversation with my dad about the situation. He's always been more level-headed, and I hoped he might help mediate. The conversation was tough but necessary. I explained everything, how much I'd loaned my brother, the broken promises, and how I felt trapped in this cycle of enabling. My dad listened without interrupting, and while he didn't outright take my side, he admitted that my brother needed to step up. He didn't think I was wrong to draw boundaries, but he also warned me that the fallout might take years to repair. A few days later, my brother reached out for what I thought might be a turning point. He sent a long message apologizing for his behavior. He said he regretted lashing out and acknowledged that he hadn't been the best brother. For a moment, I thought this might be a genuine attempt to mend things, but as I read further, it became clear he wasn't owning up to much. The apology quickly shifted into an explanation of how he felt abandoned and how hard it was to make ends meet. By the end of the message, he was asking if I'd reconsider helping him just this once so he could get back on track. I didn't respond immediately. I needed time to process whether this was a real apology or just another manipulation. The more I thought about it, the more I realized it was the latter. He wasn't taking responsibility, he was just using a different tactic to get what he wanted. I responded simply, saying I wouldn't be giving him any money unless he showed real effort to change. He didn't reply. After that, the rift in the family felt permanent. My mom's disappointment hung over every interaction like a storm cloud. My brother stopped trying to reach out entirely. Even small family updates felt tense, as if everyone was walking on eggshells. I hated the way things had turned out, but I also knew I couldn't keep sacrificing myself to fix a problem I didn't create. For now, I'm holding firm. The boundary is set, and I'm not moving it. If my brother wants to change, he'll have to do it without me funding his mistakes. It's not the resolution I hoped for, but maybe it's the one he, and the rest of the family, needs to finally face reality. Update 4. After my last conversation with my brother, things went quiet for a while at least. He didn't respond to my message, and I didn't hear from him again. My mom wasn't silent, though. She continued to reach out, usually with long, guilt-heavy texts about how I was tearing the family apart. Calls from her were shorter but just as sharp, filled with the same accusations about my lack of empathy and how my actions were ruining everything. I started to feel like every interaction with her was just another fight waiting to happen, so I kept my distance. The silence from the rest of my family didn't last long. A few days after my brother blocked me on social media, I started getting messages from extended family members. At first, I expected them to take my mom's side, but I was surprised. A few aunts and cousins actually reached out to support me. One cousin in particular told me she'd been in a similar situation with her sibling and commended me for setting boundaries. Another aunt mentioned she thought my brother had been taking advantage of me for years but never wanted to step in and say anything. It was unexpected, but their words helped me feel like I wasn't entirely alone. Meanwhile, my brother wasn't sitting idle. Since he'd cut ties with me, he started working his way down the family tree. My sister told me he'd been reaching out to just about everyone, asking for money. From what I heard, his strategy wasn't going well. Most of the extended family had either refused outright or ignored him altogether. My brother wasn't exactly subtle about why he needed the cash, and most of them weren't interested in stepping into the mess between us. The few relatives who were tempted to help quickly backed off when they realized he wasn't interested in changing his spending habits. As for my mom, she wasn't ready to give up. She called me one last time in what felt like a desperate attempt to make me cave. She went over the same arguments she'd been making for weeks. That family comes first, that I didn't understand my brother's struggles, and that I was the one creating the divide. This time, though, I decided to push back. I suggested we try family therapy, hoping it might give us a neutral space to talk things out. She rejected the idea immediately, saying we didn't need outsiders to fix our problems. It was clear she wasn't interested in solving anything unless the solution involved me stepping back into the role of financial safety net. On my end, things were finally starting to stabilize. With no more unexpected handouts, my budget was starting to recover. I managed to pay off a few lingering expenses and even set aside some money for savings, a rare luxury for me. Knowing I was in control of my finances again only reinforced my decision to stand firm. My brother, on the other hand, seemed to be spinning his wheels. Word got back to me that he'd started applying for jobs more frequently, but they were still the kind of roles he was either underqualified for or overqualified for, nothing that could actually help him get back on his feet. He kept leaning into temporary gigs but avoided committing to anything long-term. It felt like he was doing just enough to say he was trying without actually making meaningful progress. His behavior also started to become more erratic. My sister mentioned he'd been spending more time drinking and going out with friends, even though he claimed he was broke. There were even whispers from family members about him borrowing money from people outside the family, people who weren't as willing to let it slide if he didn't pay them back. I worried about him, but there wasn't much I could do from a distance. especially when every attempt I made to help him in the past had only backfired. The strain between my mom and me grew heavier with each passing week. I noticed it in the little things, her tone during conversations, the way she avoided talking to me during family calls, and the fact that she was constantly venting to other relatives about how I was unrecognizable these days. But it wasn't just about the fights anymore. It was the emotional toll of knowing our relationship wasn't what it used to be, and that it might not recover anytime soon. I stuck to my boundaries, though. Every time I felt tempted to step back in and help, I reminded myself that doing so wouldn't fix the underlying issue. My brother needed to take responsibility for his choices, and my mom needed to stop enabling him. Giving in would only restart the cycle, and I wasn't willing to go down that road again. About a month after our last interaction, my brother sent me an unexpected message. It was an apology. This time it felt more heartfelt. He admitted he'd been wrong to lash out and acknowledged that he hadn't been managing his life well. He said he wanted to make things right and asked if we could talk. I couldn't tell if the apology was genuine or just another tactic to get me back on his side, but I agreed to hear him out. We haven't had that conversation yet, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like there's a chance things might move in a better direction. I don't know if this is the start of real change or just another false start, but either way, I'm not backing down. I've made my decision, and I'm sticking to it. Whether my family can accept that or not is up to them, but for now, I'm finally at peace with the boundaries I've set. Update 5. The fallout from my decision lingered for a while, but over time, the dust started to settle. My mom still found ways to criticize me for ruining the family, but her words felt different now, less forceful, almost resigned. She'd bring up my brother in passing, mentioning how hard things were for him, but it seemed like she was running out of steam. The constant calls and texts about how I needed to step up became less frequent. What surprised me the most was how many of my friends continued to show their support. A couple of them shared stories about their own families, where they'd been pressured to take on responsibilities they couldn't handle. Hearing how they navigated those situations made me feel like I wasn't alone. One friend even joked that saying no to family should be considered a life skill, which honestly felt pretty accurate. Around this time, my brother's situation started to shift. It wasn't a huge transformation, but I started hearing from my sister that he was actually applying for jobs more seriously. He landed a part-time position at a local store, and while it wasn't enough to cover all his expenses, it was a step in the right direction. He was even talking about cutting back on unnecessary spending and focusing on saving for the first time in years. It was slow progress, but it was progress. My mom, however, wasn't ready to let go of her narrative. She kept insisting that I'd forced my brother into this situation and that I was being stubborn for no reason. But something had shifted in me. Her words didn't hit the same way they used to. I wasn't looking for her approval anymore. Instead, I focused on reinforcing my boundaries. Every time she brought it up, I reminded her that my brother needed to take responsibility for himself and that my decision wasn't about punishing him, it was about helping him grow. Eventually, I decided to suggest family therapy again. I didn't expect much, given her reaction the first time, but to my surprise, she seemed more open to the idea. I think the ongoing tension was wearing on her, and maybe she realized that we weren't going to move forward without some kind of outside help. We scheduled a session, and while it wasn't a magical fix, it felt like a step toward understanding each other better. Over the next few weeks, the tension between my mom and me started to ease. Our conversations were less heated, though they still felt cautious. It was clear that we were both trying to repair the relationship, even if neither of us was fully ready to let go of the past. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As for my brother, he was slowly learning how to stand on his own. He started budgeting more carefully and took on additional shifts at work to make ends meet. He still had moments where he'd reach out to family members for help, but they were fewer and farther between. It was obvious he wasn't thrilled about being independent, but he was making it work. My sister told me he'd even mentioned feeling proud of himself for the first time in a long time. I stayed firm on my decision not to loan him money. Whenever he reached out, I reminded him that my support would come in the form of advice or encouragement, not financial assistance. At first, he didn't take it well, but over time, he stopped asking. It felt like he was finally starting to accept that the old dynamic wasn't coming back. About a month ago, my brother reached out again. This time, his apology felt different. He admitted that he'd been unfair to me and that he understood why I made the choices I did. He didn't ask for anything. He just wanted to let me know that he appreciated the boundaries I'd set, even if it had taken him a while to see it. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page. Shortly after, I had a final, honest conversation with my mom about everything that had happened. I explained my perspective, not just about my brother, but about what it had been like to feel responsible for fixing everyone else's problems. I told her that stepping back wasn't about abandoning the family, it was about making sure I could take care of myself too. She listened, and while she didn't fully agree, she seemed to understand. For the first time in months, the conversation didn't feel like a battle. Since then, things have been slowly improving. My brother and I are rebuilding our relationship, one step at a time. He's still figuring things out, but I can see that he's trying. My mom and I are on better terms, though we're still careful around certain topics. The rest of the family seems to have accepted the new normal, and the drama has finally started to fade into the background. On a personal level, I feel more stable than I have in years. My finances are in good shape, and I'm no longer constantly stressed about unexpected requests for money. I've learned how to say no, even when it's uncomfortable, and I've realized that setting boundaries doesn't make me a bad person, it makes me a healthier one. Looking back, this experience has completely changed how I view family dynamics. I used to think that being there for family meant saying yes to everything, no matter the cost. Now I understand that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect and accountability, not one-sided sacrifices. It hasn't been easy, but I know I made the right decision for myself, for my brother, and for the family as a whole.